The war is over, but the aftermath lingers in the empty hangars and forgotten airfields of the Soviet Union. Thousands of warplanes, once vital to Soviet military might, now stand abandoned, silent, rusting relics of a past that has been swept aside. These machines, built for a purpose that no longer exists, are left to decay in the open air. A vast stockpile of military power rendered useless by peace, now just a reminder of an era that quickly moved on. Their engines are cold, their wings bent, and their legacy fading. What happens to the weapons of war when there is no war left to fight? The war was over. The factories that once hummed with the urgency of conflict fell silent. The hangars where planes had been meticulously constructed, repaired, and prepped for battle now stood empty. There was no longer the need for the hundreds of thousands of warplanes that had once filled Soviet skies with their thunderous roars. But what happened to the vast stockpile of aircraft that had been produced, now rendered obsolete by a peace they could not comprehend? The Soviet Union, like all victorious nations, faced the monumental task of transitioning from war to peace. Yet, unlike the Marshall Plan in Western Europe, the post-war Soviet recovery was fraught with its own distinct set of challenges. Its economy was battered, its infrastructure stretched thin, and its resources were consumed in the pursuit of victory. Now, in the years following the war, it had to contend with a new reality, a surplus of equipment, including an overwhelming number of warplanes, most of which would never see the sky again. By the end of World War II, the Soviet Union had manufactured over 100,000 aircraft. These ranged from multi-role fighters and bombers to reconnaissance planes, transport aircraft, and trainers. The sheer quantity was staggering, with production peaking at 40,000 planes in 1944 alone. However, the vast majority of these warplanes were designed with combat in mind. Now that the war had ended, the sudden shift in military doctrine and the severe economic constraints made many of these machines not just redundant, but an unbearable financial burden. Many of the aircraft that had been key to Soviet victories were now considered obsolete. Aircraft like the Il-2 Sturmovik, which had been the backbone of the Soviet ground attack force, were no longer suited for modernized peacetime needs. Similarly, the Yakovlev Yak-9, once an iconic Soviet fighter, was now outdated by the swift pace of aerial warfare innovation. The Soviet Union's immediate challenge was how to handle these immense quantities of warplanes in a time when resources were already stretched to breaking point. The question of disposal became pressing. Initially, the plan was to preserve a fraction of these planes for potential future conflicts. The Soviet leadership under Joseph Stalin's regime had always been cautious, aware of the ever-present threat of Western powers. However, as the years passed and tensions with the West did not immediately erupt into open war, the realities of a peacetime economy began to take hold. By the late 1940s, Soviet officials began to recognize that maintaining so many aircraft was both impractical and costly. The large-scale disbandment of warplanes began in earnest. Some were simply abandoned, left to rust in the open air, their engines seized, and their wings torn by the elements. The weather was unforgiving. Many planes were found in remote airfields, far from the main industrial hubs, abandoned to deteriorate into ghostly hulks of metal. In other cases, the warplanes were systematically dismantled. A process of scrapping, piece by piece, saw thousands of aircraft reduced to raw materials. But the scale of this operation was a logistical nightmare. It required vast manpower and resources to break down these planes. Men who, ironically, had once flown these very machines in battle now being tasked with taking them apart, often in harsh conditions. Factories and metal processing plants converted to meet the demand for material recovery, and every part of the planes that could be repurposed was eventually recycled. Engines, propellers, and fuselages were stripped down, melted, and turned into tools, agricultural machinery, and construction materials. These efforts were critical to the Soviet economy's recovery, but the amount of aircraft involved meant that the process continued for years. And still, even more warplanes were stored in massive quantities, tucked into hangars, lined up along runways, stacked up in military depots. Some planes sat idle for decades, still perfectly intact, but with no role to play in the peacetime military structure. These silent relics remained a reminder of a war that was no longer present. In the years that followed, as the Cold War began to take shape, some of these planes were resurrected, pulled from their long-term storage in an effort to bolster the Soviet Union's growing military stockpile. However, the majority remained abandoned, their futures sealed by the economic and logistical pressure that made them unsustainable. This fate of the Soviet warplanes was not unique to the Soviet Union alone. All the great powers faced similar dilemmas in the aftermath of the war. Yet, for the USSR, the question of what to do with the aircraft was complicated by a unique mix of geopolitics and economic strain. At a time when the Soviet leadership was focused on rebuilding its war-torn society and maintaining control over vast new territories, the fate of so many planes seemed less urgent. The sheer numbers were overwhelming. The scope of this destruction of Soviet aircraft remained largely hidden for years. The planes that had once symbolized Soviet might were now reduced to scrap, an invisible consequence of war's end. As the Cold War slowly emerged, the Soviet Union's attention turned increasingly toward the future, and those machines, once so vital, faded from view. But it wasn't just the Soviet Union that faced this dilemma. Across the Eastern Bloc, in the countries that had fallen under Soviet influence or control, similar scenes unfolded. Planes that had been part of the Red Army Air Force's operations in Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia were also abandoned or scrapped. These countries, too, faced the pressures of war's aftermath and the difficult task of coming to terms with the need to rebuild, not just their economies, but their military infrastructures as well. Yet, not all aircraft met such a grim fate. A small number were repurposed for civilian use. In some cases, Soviet aircraft found new lives in commercial aviation or in other industries. The Russian Aeroflot, for example, adopted surplus warplanes for civilian air travel. The Soviet Union also looked at its aviation needs with an eye on technological advancement, and some aircraft were mothballed for future testing or as potential models for later, more advanced designs. Still, for most, the fate of the aircraft was clear: scrap or neglect. These planes would never fly again. The wind would never rush past their wings. They would be melted down, used for something far less heroic than their original purpose. And as the years went by, fewer and fewer of them remained, shaped into something else, far removed from their history, until they, too, were gone. The magnitude of what had been lost, the sheer weight of material destruction, is not easily captured by numbers alone. The stories of these aircraft, the crews that had flown them, the battles they had been part of, and the potential they had once held, faded. What remained were only their shadows in the scrap yards and forgotten hangars of post-war Soviet life. After the initial phase of dismantling and scrapping, the Soviet Union faced an uncertain reality regarding the vast quantities of aircraft that had been rendered surplus. By the early 1950s, it had become clear that there was little immediate use for these aircraft, but their legacy, whether in physical form as discarded shells of metal or as a symbol of a different era, remained a significant part of the Soviet military's history. The sheer scale of the problem was staggering. The Soviet Union had created one of the largest air forces in the world during the Second World War. Aircraft factories in Moscow, Kazan, and Novosibirsk had churned out planes at a pace unseen before. But when the war ended, it wasn't just the warplanes that posed a challenge, it was the infrastructure. Airfields, maintenance depots, and storage facilities all had to be reimagined or repurposed. What had once been a network built to support an aggressive wartime strategy now had to support a peacetime environment, or simply fall into decay. The majority of Soviet warplanes, which numbered in the tens of thousands, found themselves either abandoned in fields or stored in warehouses, waiting for a resolution that never came. By the mid-1950s, new aircraft designs began to emerge. The MiG-15, Yak-23, and the Tu-4, which had been Soviet attempts to catch up with the rapidly advancing jet technologies of the West, were beginning to dominate the skies. These new aircraft, faster and more capable, made the older warplanes, especially the piston-engine fighters and bombers, untenable for further military use. Some of the planes that had once been cutting-edge were simply too slow and outdated to keep. This technological leap effectively rendered the warplanes of the 1940s irrelevant. For those that were not discarded outright, the question of repurposing remained. Some Soviet leaders saw the scrapping process as part of the painful but necessary transition to a more modern military. There were also efforts to recycle parts, with engines and other components being reused in the construction of new planes. In many cases, the labor-intensive process of dismantling was simply too expensive to be sustainable on any large scale, and so, vast quantities of aircraft were left to rot in the elements. Some of these planes, however, were kept in reserve, tucked away in the sprawling storage depots of the Soviet Union, waiting for a possible future use. The idea was to have a stockpile of ready-to-use machines if ever the threat of war with the West turned into something more concrete. Yet, even as the Cold War tensions escalated, this vast collection of unused aircraft grew less and less relevant as new weapons systems took their place. For many years, the remnants of these warplanes lay forgotten. The Soviet Union, consumed by the demands of the Cold War, was focused on building its future, not on preserving its past. The planes that had once been the pride of the Soviet war effort, the IL-2s, the Yak-3s, the La-5s, were left behind in old hangars and overgrown airstrips, gathering dust and corrosion. The Soviet leadership had other concerns. Nuclear missiles, tanks, and modern aircraft were now the focus of military strategy. But there were still some traces of those bygone years that couldn't be erased. In places like the sprawling deserts of Kazakhstan and the vast plains of Siberia, abandoned Soviet aircraft were left scattered across the landscape, slowly succumbing to the harsh elements. In some areas, you could still find the remains of planes lying in fields, their fuselages cracked, their engines removed, their wings bent by years of exposure. These ghostly remnants of the Soviet Union's wartime past were a stark reminder of the scale of production during the war and the speed at which the world had moved on from them. The official Soviet stance on this large-scale abandonment of warplanes was largely muted. There was no grand ceremony or acknowledgement of the plane's historical significance. Instead, the fate of these warplanes was left largely undocumented for decades. The focus was on building the future, not memorializing the past. And in a way, that was the tragedy of the whole situation. The aircraft, once a symbol of Soviet technological prowess and military might, were simply discarded, repurposed, scrapped, or left to deteriorate into obscurity. Yet, despite the overwhelming sense of neglect, there were small pockets of preservation. Some aircraft, particularly those that had played a significant role in the war, were kept as museum pieces. In the decades following the war, museums began to open, and small collections of warplanes were assembled, many of which were maintained in pristine condition for historical record. But these were the exceptions, not the rule. Most of the planes, those that had been built by the thousands, were simply left to rust away in hangars or scrap yards. Their only legacy was as a cost, an economic and logistical burden that the Soviet Union was ultimately not willing or able to manage. The passing years saw a gradual shift in how these planes were viewed. In the 1960s and 1970s, there were a few attempts to revisit the idea of repurposing some of the older aircraft for civilian uses, but these were few and far between. The primary role of the Soviet Union's military was changing, and older warplanes no longer had a place in that new vision. The Soviet economy, which had been strained during the war, was still reeling from the aftermath. Resources were scarce, and the government had no interest in maintaining fleets of obsolete planes. Instead, Soviet industry shifted its focus to new innovations, new technologies that could keep pace with the demands of the Cold War. In the 1980s, with the Soviet Union on the brink of collapse, the issue of surplus aircraft was relegated to history. The planes, which had once played such a significant role in the war effort, were increasingly forgotten. They had served their purpose, but their continued existence served only to highlight the inefficiency of the Soviet system, the inability to adapt quickly, the unwillingness to look back, and the relentless march toward modernization at the expense of the past. Today, these forgotten warplanes lie in scrapyards, in the back corners of military bases, or still abandoned in far-off fields. Some have been reclaimed by private collectors or aviation enthusiasts, preserved as artifacts from a bygone era. Others remain, silently decaying, rusting into nothingness. Few people remember them now, and fewer still consider what these aircraft once represented. In some respects, The fate of the Soviet warplanes serves as a microcosm for the Soviet Union itself. Just as the aircraft were rendered obsolete, so too was the Soviet system, unable to keep pace with the demands of the modern world. The warplanes were powerful in their time, a crucial element in the Soviet war machine, but in the end, they were discarded, swept aside by the relentless tide of history. In the midst of this large-scale abandonment and destruction, there remains a lingering sense of loss. Not for the aircraft themselves, perhaps, but for the realization that such a significant part of history, part of the legacy of the Soviet Union, was allowed to slip away without much notice. These machines, built by the hands of thousands, flown by soldiers and engineered for war, were not simply scraps of metal. They represented a moment in time, a moment when the Soviet Union, its people, and its aspirations were at the height of their ambition. And then, just as quickly as they had risen to prominence, they were gone, lost to time and indifference. Today, only a handful of these warplanes remain in any form. Some are carefully preserved in museums, honored for their place in history. But for the vast majority, their fate is sealed. Left to rot, recycled into something new, or forgotten in the harshest corners of the Soviet Union, these planes no longer soar through the skies. They have become relics, not of war, but of a world that no longer needed them. And so, in the end, they too have become casualties of history, forgotten, abandoned, and lost to time.